Hello everybody, my name is Rory Barr. I head up our logistics, freight and supply chain market here at JB Andrews, a market that's rapidly growing within our business but also within the overall logistics industry, which is why on today's episode of Leading Logistics we are speaking with Charley Dehoney, Vice President of Technology Startup Accelerator Zebox. When approached to do this episode of Leading Logistics, Charley was the first person that I reached out to. I've had a great relationship with him over the last year or so. He's been a key individual in the industry for some time now as an angel investor and even holding positions within logistics technology businesses. We dissect the industry, we talk about the trends, he gives us some insight into where the industry might be going, as well as giving us some insight into Zebox and what they do today. Whether you're new to the industry or you're an industry veteran, this episode of Leading Logistics is sure to provide some new and interesting insights into the logistics technology world. We hope you enjoy the episode, and I would personally love to talk about the topics covered today in the comment section below. Charley, we'll start with obviously the first point. What does Zebox mean to you?
Zebox is a community of innovative companies that have come together with a vision of changing supply chain and logistics of the future through technology and innovation. So on one end of our spectrum, we've got our corporate partner groups, and these are large established corporations, international corporations that are focused on supply chain logistics mobility.
Yeah.
And then on the other end of our spectrum is we have the startup entrepreneur community that we're connected to, and we're constantly like surveying the landscape and figuring out who's working on interesting challenges. And then Zebox, our team inside of the four walls of Zebox, our focus is to consult with the corporate partner groups and find ways to drive innovation and change in their business model of the future. And then to connect those corporate partners with specific startups that can solve problems that are already known and defined inside the organization.
Amazing. And today, what is your role within Zebox? How did you get there? How did you come across the business?
So I've been involved in the logistics tech ecosystem for many years as a founder, angel investor, early stage advisor, marriage counselor, janitor, general champion of the space. And having done a number of angel investments and supported a number of companies as an advisor over the last 4 or 5 years, I was approached by a founder that I had supported previously that sold his company a couple of years ago. Yeah. And he shared with me the plans of CMA CGM Group to expand their logistics tech accelerator into America, and said that they were looking for somebody to lead that practice. So at the time, that's when you and I met, actually, was at the time you and I were working together as I was building out a global freight marketplace, automating and digitizing global trade. And this sounded like a really interesting challenge and very, very unique timing, obviously, with the last 2.5 years of supply chain disruption. It seemed to fit kind of my personal passion of supporting founders and backing innovative startups, and also provide a unique challenge to help these startups kind of traverse, from their early stage to get into sort of enterprise ready positions to address these challenges. So I got the introduction to the team with the CMA CGM Group here in America. It's an amazing company. They're a tremendously entrepreneurial company. So where I've never fit inside of large organizations in my past career, I felt uniquely suited to work with this group of entrepreneurial folks in this family-owned business to drive some global innovation.
Nice, very good, very good. And you've done some very good work so far. I know, you've put me in touch with a few people we've had some success with already, which is good to see.
Great.
I'm watching closely. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of it next for sure. So for the people that don't know and the people that would be tuning in, talk to us about, so obviously what Zebox is, what they are doing, how they operate. I know you said obviously it's a community, but you have 3 hubs globally. Is DC moving from Arlington, or is that going to be a new hub?
Yeah, got it. So let me talk a little bit about the history of Zebox, and then share with you a little bit more about where we sit today and what the global vision is for the organization. So Zebox was the idea of the chairman of the CMA CGM group, Rodolphe Sade. Rodolphe took over the business from his father, who started the company over 40 years ago. And this family, the Sade family, has been transformative in the world of global trade and containerization of freight. This was one of the first companies to put cargo in boxes and move it over the ocean. So this company was born out of innovation. Yeah. And as Rodolphe took over and transitioned into the chairman role, he was very focused on driving innovation and keeping the entrepreneurial spirit that had taken the company into the position as a global leader that it is now. So 4 years ago, he had the vision to create a logistics technology accelerator in Marseille, France, to drive innovation into his business and also support the community that had supported him as his family grew the company. So with the vision of connecting startups and his corporate trade partners and his company, he created the facility in Marseille. They've taken more of like a traditional incubation acceleration approach to entrepreneurship, and really have fostered a number of startups, more than 50 startups, and helped them raise tens of millions of euros into the innovation community, and really done some interesting, collaboration between the corporate partners and the startups. So as Rodolphe saw that business starting to expand, he envisioned having a global network of hubs very similar to the global network of steamship companies that he operates today. Mm-hmm. So the second hub is actually opening in the Caribbean, in Guadeloupe. Nice. To foster innovation in trade and also sustainability of the oceans. And then we're opening our facility in Arlington, which is actually near DC, just across the river from Washington, DC, from the capital. How bad? And so, well, your American geography is probably better than my European geography. So, so you have that going. But so we're actually, I'm in the facility today. We're just across the Potomac River from the Washington Monument and the Capitol building. So we have beautiful views of Reagan International Airport, and we are able to foster and support innovation from the local startup community. And we're currently working with a couple of startups to actually move into the facility that will be opening here in just a couple of weeks. So we're very excited about that, but we're much more than just a physical place. So we have 15,000 square foot of innovation space here in DC, where we're welcoming startups and innovative companies to come together and collaborate. But as we expand the global footprint of hubs, we'll now have the Marseille hub, we'll have the US hub, we'll have the Caribbean hub, soon to announce a hub in North Africa, where we're going to be supporting entrepreneurship on that continent. Amazing. And then we'd like to be able to announce another hub somewhere in Asia later this year. Now, the final two hubs are not official plans yet, but you can follow that Rodolphe's vision is to connect the most innovative companies from all of the corners of the world and bring those innovative companies into the community. So in addition to CMA CGM Group and CEVA Logistics, they're a subsidiary in the freight forwarding space. CMA is the third largest steam shipping line in the world, and CEVA Logistics is the fourth largest contract logistics provider in the world. So those are our two founding partners. And then here in the US, we're also very fortunate to be supported by BNSF, the railroad, Track Intermodal, the chassis provider, Project 44, the data visibility provider, Ingram Marine Services, who operate all of the barges and the inland waterways up and down the US, as well as Cargomatic, the first digital freight brokerage company, EDRE, which does import and destination management for large importers. And then we've got a couple of other corporate partners that have already committed and been announced, as well as several more in the pipeline. So we're very fortunate to work with some of the titans of the supply chain and be able to kind of get inside their businesses and create like a safe space where we can talk openly about opportunities for innovation and change. Mm-hmm. And then it's my great honor to go back and take those opportunities to the startup community, and then work with these entrepreneurs to develop their messaging and their product offerings to maybe align to these problems that we're finding out, and then hopefully, continue to produce really transformative proof of concepts and pilots that turn into commercial relationships and start to shape the industry of the future.
No, 100%. And you've talked about some of the, the real disruptors, some of the real giants that are backing this vision, and working with those companies in the space. I'm sure they're providing their insight as well, which is something that I'm excited to look further into. You talk about these hubs, you talk about expansion, and obviously following the vision of CMA. So how important is it today to branch out and extend Zebox's presence around the globe? How vital is that for you guys?
I mean, look, this is critically important. The reality is, if we've seen nothing else in the last 10 years in technology development and innovation, is that great ideas and innovation is everywhere, and opportunity historically has not been. So the US is very, very fortunate to have a robust, mature startup ecosystem, rich with venture capitalists and university support and accelerators like ours to get involved and help founders find their way. These don't exist in every corner of the world. So we're very, very proud of the progress that we've shown in Europe. And we're more proud and excited to be able to extend this innovation community into these areas of the world, like North Africa, that historically have been underrepresented and served. But it's imperative for the vision of our chairman, Rodolphe Saudet, that we're supporting the communities that we're serving globally as a foundational member of the global trade network today. And we also envision that my personal obligation and responsibility here in the US that I take very seriously is to develop and cultivate a community of supportive corporate partners, supportive founders, like-minded companies all across the different spectrums of their life cycle, to create an infrastructure and a framework that can welcome soft landings for startups who want to develop the business in the US. And if somebody is right now building out a proof of concept in sustainability or supply chain and logistics technology, or new ways of fueling vessels, or maybe building the payment or the electrification infrastructure of the next generation of our industry, if that's getting developed anywhere in the world, Zebox wants to be a support mechanism for that organization to help them get the coaching, the mentorship, the access to the experts, the access to the commercial actors that can actually sign big checks and write big contracts to reward these startups for their innovation. And we want to be that connective device between those two organizations, where they discover one another, they get to know one another, and then together we work to define the parameters and the framework around how can these two organizations work together in a very efficient and testable and measurable way. And then we can embark on these proof of concepts together as a community, and we can all watch as the innovation comes. And looking inside of the sausage factory is never as glamorous as people think it might be. But this is the hard work, and this is the work that we're doing at Zebox to make sure that these discussions are being had, and that the follow-up email is being sent, and that the founder is not giving up or getting fatigued on the long sales cycle, and that the corporate partner isn't forgetting about that great idea we all had in the meeting just before lunch. So it takes some focus and some energy to get people excited about these discussions, but we're very fortunate to be aligned with these companies who are supporting us financially and also through their actions to bring this innovation out of the startup ecosystem and get it into the mainstream.
Yeah, no, and that's vitally important for sure. So when we're looking at today's environment, today's society, from where we've been in the last 2 years, one of the main points that always crops up is how have these companies fared through the pandemic? How have they grown? How have they how has the industry changed as well is another one. So with the companies that Zebox and even yourself have incubated and accelerated, how have they fared throughout the pandemic?
So it's been an interesting time, to say the least. I think there's been a couple of underlying trends and factors that have really accelerated the change and the innovation curve that we've seen over the last couple of years. And so I'll answer this question not from my perspective previously as an operator, but more now as my perspective of this steward and facilitator of innovation. Yeah. And what I've seen is over the last couple of years is two things. One, the mainstream media has started to shine the light into the scale of the logistics supply chain technology industry, and also started to highlight some of the problems that have been obvious to some of us in the industry, but are non-obvious to people that are outside of the space. Yeah. And so as you've shown the world what these problems are, it's subsequently attracting some of the brightest people in the world that historically maybe would have gone into biotechnology, or maybe they would have pursued a career in finance. But now they're looking at global trade and logistics and saying, hey, we can do something here. So those two things have really sparked a lot of interest. And then I think, the pandemic taught people a new way to kind of like grow their networks and live and exist with one another. So, personally, I've supported as an angel investor in the last 2.5 years, a number of companies where the founders have like very rarely even been in the same room together. Maybe they met through a friend of a friend. Maybe they met over Twitter. They figured out quickly that they're like-minded and they set out to build a company together. So a lot of companies that launched, maybe in 2020 are now gearing up for their Series A, meaning they've gone through their journey. They've built a product together. Many of these companies are 100% remote and they're distributed. And they're just now post-pandemic getting into the room together as a team for the very first time. So it's been exciting to see the younger generation of entrepreneurs, really kind of overcoming adversity, which is a hallmark of any good entrepreneur, as they break down barriers and they get through obstacles. So the lack of access to in-person contact was in no way an inhibitor to growth in the space. In fact, I think it was an accelerant because people were sitting around and they're thinking, hey, if I've got 2 years to kind of work from home, or I've got this time on my hands where maybe I'm not as stimulated as I once was, maybe I can start working on something with somebody. Maybe I can get in touch with someone and see what they're working on, and we can do something together. So, those trends have really like driven a lot of innovation at the low end on the startup side of the marketplace, and then on the higher end. At Zebox, we don't have to do anything to tell the rest of the world that like the supply chain needs some attention, right? I mean, the White House is telling this story, mainstream media is telling this story. And so we're really excited to, just be sort of in the right place at the right time. And we're here as a resource for the large corporations of the world who are looking into their supply chain and saying like, hey, how do we get out ahead of this? How do we go from being 100% reactive and reliant upon, a network of providers to, getting on the other side of this and coming out of, the next wave of innovation out ahead of things and looking at the future and actually de-risking our supply chains by making informed decisions, leveraging data, leveraging new technologies. So, these are the conversations that we're having. And right now, the one thing that we're not seeing is large global organizations turning their back on supply chain. Like everybody's leaning into this discussion, and we're here and happy to just be a resource for the global community.
Yeah, no, you are right. No one's really sort of ignoring it. I think now, especially after the last 2 years, everyone's realized this is the time to change, go away from that archaic footprint. No, for sure. It's definitely interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the coming years as well. I'm sure we'll see some big companies making some interesting acquisitions into helping themselves grow further, especially. So, no, I like that. So with that, have you seen the market change as a result of the pandemic?
Well, look, I think in the very beginning, in the early days of call it March 2020, there was a short-term pause when the venture markets kind of contracted, and I would say that was like maybe 2 to 4 weeks. But there was a little bit of slowdown in the deployment of capital. I think since that time, we've just seen a consistent, substantial escalation in the amount of capital, being deployed. And in fact, I read last night about a $6.5 million seed round that just got announced yesterday. And, that was a Series A round, that was a Series A round 7 years ago. And that was a Series B round 10 years ago. So the amount of money that's coming into our space for trusted and known founders, particularly founders who have already like developed a product or service in the logistics and supply chain space. Yes. It seems like folks are just throwing money at those people. So I think the only thing that's really inhibited that a little bit that I think the rest of the world is also, keen to kind of keep their eye on is the last 5 weeks of what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine. One of the most unfortunate situations I think that any of us have ever had to witness, and something I don't think that any of us ever really thought we would see in our lifetimes in this day and age of camera phones and social media. Yeah. But despite all the horrific, happenings over there, I think there's a general consensus that access to capital may dry up at the high end, and that's going to trickle down to the VCs and the seed funds. But I think, I brought up the $6.5 million seed round yesterday that was announced yesterday as maybe an example of that deal was probably getting announced or was probably getting cut, 6 to 8 weeks ago, maybe 12 weeks ago. So, what we're hearing today is generally in arrears of what was going on, a month and a half to 3 months ago in the deal market. So it'll be interesting to track progress over the next 45 to 60 days and see if some of this newly deployed capital into the seed stage funds is actually going to be then in turn deployed out to the startups, or if folks might take a let's wait and see type of mentality and see if the valuations on the startup side of technology businesses are going to follow what we've seen in the public markets over the last 8 weeks, which has really been, kind of a 40% decline in valuations in some categories of SaaS companies. Yeah. And when you see that happening on the publicly traded side, you can almost inevitably assume it's going to happen, and trickle down into the growth and the early stage side. But I think what we're seeing now is that, to kind of round this out, very long answer here, but I think to round this out, the disruption that we're seeing in Europe right now, in my opinion, is just going to exacerbate a lot of the, already kind of like problems that we're seeing in the global supply chain. So I think we're in for another couple of years of hard times. Truthfully, I think there's a lot of capacity that comes out of the market with Russia, being involved in these sanctions, et cetera. So I think, while maybe the capital markets might be facing some different challenges, interest rates are going up, maybe the public markets aren't faring as well. All of these things can change the way that large investors may behave. But I think the ongoing issues in supply chain are going to continue to create opportunities for nice businesses to be built. And, the one thing I do know in my limited history of economics is I do know that there's always a market for a well-run, profitable company. So there's always going to be entrepreneurs that are aiming for that.
No, 100%. And, touching on the Russia-Ukraine conflict there, and, what we're already seeing off the coast of California as well with the issues when we look at ocean freight. There's opportunities there for businesses to step in and revolutionize the way that we've actually seen trade and freight being moved, really. And going back to your point about the amount of money that's been invested in this space at the moment, you look at, your Flexports and your Fortos of the world. I mean, the amount of investment that's gone into those two companies, I don't think we would have ever seen 5 years ago. Flexport in terms of just raising capital well over 2 billion, and Forto in terms of valuation over 2 billion. It's crazy money. It definitely is. But you look further down the stream, like you said, some companies at Series A are, making serious waves in terms of the amount of money that they're receiving at that stage, even more than those two that I mentioned previously. The first one that comes to mind is, the New York Shipping Exchange. They've received well over 30 million in their Series A, which is, I think, off the top of my head, I think it's more than both Forto and Flexport receiving their Series A. So, you do see it, and it's I think it definitely, like you said, been in the works before. It was announced many weeks ahead of time, but it's also paving the way for their success. And who knows, more money. SoftBank are going to have to line their pockets, really, aren't they? They're really investing.
Yeah. I think in the early days of logistics tech, venture-backed kind of companies, the pitch deck was very long, and most of the messaging was around educating the investors about the industry.
Yeah.
So there's certainly some investors that have kind of like gotten up the learn curve pretty quickly and really figured out kind of where they want to be. And I think at that time, 10 years ago, had you told me that there's going to be this company called SoftBank and this company called Tiger that are just going to come in and kind of, pick up some of these late stage startups and carry them on their back to get them to a public exit or to get them to, a significant outcome. If you would have told me that, I would have been like, man, that sounds great. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I mean, here we are, and it is happening. And there's never been a better time to be a founder or an early stage contributor in the logistics and supply chain technology space. And so, one thing I noticed about this community, and I think it's born from our roots of being more competitive than cooperative, historically in logistics and supply chain, there's always this sort of temptation to throw stones at the other guys and say, well, they're really not doing anything special. That's just smoke and mirrors. And you hear that a lot in our space. And I was having a discussion with my friend Eric Johnson from the Journal of Commerce the other day when he stopped by Zebox to check out the facility. And, we were kind of riffing on that point. And I thought to myself, and I said to Eric, like, hey, we're 10, 12 years into this. Like, surely some people have built some tech, right? Everybody can't be smoke and mirrors, just depending on who you're working for and maybe who you invested in. And so I think we're going to see the corner turn. I really do, where companies are going to be less, sort of defined as tech enabled, and they'll be more defined as like industry leading and innovative. Because innovation comes in all areas. It doesn't just come in the form of new software or new hardware. Innovation can really come in the form of process or communication or business model. And so I think the technology, the framework and the foundational technology, the APIs, the cloud frameworks, the AWSs and the Herokus of the world have enabled the development of new businesses that we didn't have before, and they can be deployed quickly. So, I don't think this money that's coming to the space is going to have any difficulty finding a place to live, because there's a lot of innovation happening.
Yeah, no, there really is. There really is. And you see it, like you said, almost every day there's a new round that's being announced with some brand new tech. So yeah, who knows what's going to come tomorrow, really. So touching on the point, we look at the current crisis is going on, with Ukraine, with what's going on on the coast of California. Generally speaking, even just post-pandemic, why do you think it's important to have these, logistics and supply chain tech companies coming into the market, changing the way even some of the companies that you represent with Zebox? Why is it important to have them in the market today?
So I think it's critically important to understand like what's happened to the logistics industry and the supply chain industry over the last 15 years since technology's come in. Is what you saw is like a kind of an unbundling of the service provider. So to be a carrier, you still need to own boats, trains, trucks, planes, but to be an intermediary, be a third party, the barriers to entry have been really taken down as more data products are available for pricing discovery or tracking capabilities through visibility platforms or billing automation. A lot of the things that the freight forwarder or the freight broker or the 3PL used to do for the shipper have been democratized and made available to the shipper through a SaaS platform.
Yeah.
So I think as things have been unbundled, you're now starting to see this really interesting opportunity for service providers to come back in and rebundle those things in a thoughtful way and give them to the shipper in the bits and bytes and the chunks that they want, and deliver it to the shipper in the environment that they want to be in. So the shipper wants more visibility, more pricing control, more predictability, more communication. That's what they want. They wouldn't say it that way. They would say, when are you going to pick it up? When are you going to deliver it? And how quickly can you tell me when those two things change? And then within that is like, yeah, you had to give me a fair price or we wouldn't be having this discussion, right?
Yeah.
So the shipper just wants those things, and they want those things like in their platform that they're using day to day. They don't want to be swivel chairing. The days of buying an operator, one more monitor, and calling that like innovation, those are gone. People want integration. They want everything in one place. So you have to have these folks coming in and looking at these problems from their unique view of the world to get to the right answer, to get to the right solution. I'll give you an example. A lot of companies right now are trying to like relieve the congestion in the ports. And a lot of companies would tell you that they have a way to help drivers stay loaded, keep moving more, and keep the containers coming in and going out of the ports, right? And I could go on and on about the startups that will tell you they're solving that problem, they're fixing that problem. And what you find is when you get inside of the ports is that problem isn't one problem. It's a million different problems, because we have hours of service issues with this driver. We have compliance requirements for the driver's licensing and their equipment. We have scheduling issues. We have labor constraints, we have visibility issues. Maybe somebody's showing up to pick up a container and people know that the container's in the port. They're just not quite sure where that might be. Yeah. And so all of this like confluence of all of these issues really is like focused on that destination port and getting those products out of the port to their final destination as quickly as possible. And then, you know, when you get into it and you start talking to people who have really been studying that problem for many, many years, you know, this isn't the first time our ports have been congested. I mean, it's been an ongoing issue that comes up and down, you know, for 10 years now, and even longer. But the people that really know the issues know that the right answer is to actually work with the origin ports and to stack and arrange the containers differently, so that there's not just like a big bag of Legos that are getting dropped off in the port and then everybody's kind of shuffling through to figure it out. And if you can get to that level of granularity on the data side at the port of origin and everybody's working off the same information, then and only then you'll have the opportunity to actually start to affect change and drive some innovation around the way those containers are, the empty containers are brought in and swapped out for full containers that need to go get delivered. And the trucking companies will at that point start to have better information to better staff their equipment and make sure that drivers have time to get in the port and out of the port and still make their deliveries on time. So one small example of why, you know, you really need people going deep and studying these like particular like nagging problems and really studying those things for years and years at a time until they can get to the right solution. And then of course, driving that change across the industry is a whole other challenge, but you can't even have that discussion later until you have the innovation on the front.
Yeah, no, of course. So with that in mind, I mean, what would you say are the sort of, you know, you mentioned there's many problems that we're seeing in the ports, for example, today. What would you say are maybe the 5 main benefits of using new logistics technology in the market today?
So I would say, like, you know, efficiency is key, right? Efficiency has many benefits, but mostly I think we can sum it up by just saying people in society today just want shit to work the right way. They want stuff to be like dialed in, Amazon experience, one click buy, deliver, make it work. And so until we can connect all the disparate dots in a supply chain, we'll never give the end consumer, the customer who's like, you know, figuratively signing the check and paying the money, we'll never give them the experience that they want until we're all working off the same information, and we have to be efficient. So, you know, I think that's critically important. I would say within that, you know, another kind of bullet point would be around transparency. Yeah. You know, going back to my statement earlier, what the customer really wants is like, hey, how quickly can you tell me when something's not going to be here? You already told me when it was going to get here. You told me when it left. When that changes, like, let me know. So I'm not sitting around waiting, you know? Yeah. And that level of transparency is like the minimum expectation for the younger generation. I have 3 children, 11, 9, and 6. And, you know, it's almost going to be physically impossible for those kids to do like an offline transaction or call somebody to get a status update on something. They just won't understand it. Yeah. Like they've been raised in a world where transparency is a table stake. So, you know, I think that's going to be the expectation of the future. And so we need to develop that and make sure that we're delivering it. And then I would say, you know, like to round it out, finally, I would say not least important, you know, still in the top 3 most important factors, but maybe the singular most important factor, but not getting enough attention yet, would be sustainability. Like our industry has historically led the charge in being good stewards of the environment. And I think when we're the ones that are touching the assets and the equipment and seeing the emissions and breathing the exhaust. So I think our people know in our industry, they know it's real and they know what's been happening and they know that we can drive change and we can do better. And I can say, you know, looking from the maritime space, from the fleet owners like CMA CGM Group and others, and going on to, you know, the trucking agencies, the larger firms here in the US, like with some of the electrification initiatives, and Zebox Logistics recently partnering with with Kodiak to drive some innovation in autonomous vehicles and electrification.
Mm-hmm.
The asset owners and the equipment owners are aware, and they're realizing that it's up to us to drive this change. And I'm seeing material moves being made in that space. So, those are the areas that I really think it's incumbent on us as the innovation community to keep people thinking about those kind of three key categories.
Yeah, no, good. And you talk about the innovation community, you talk about growth. You're very active on LinkedIn. I noticed that because I live my life on LinkedIn. And you obviously, since we've known each other, I know that you have a history of writing for Freightwaves as well, which is another great tool for people to keep in touch with the market. Do you see LinkedIn as a massive tool for your own, helping grow your own brand presence, but also do you see it as somewhere where companies nowadays can use it as their own tool of growing within the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wasn't really thinking about this going into the discussion, but I'm glad you brought it up because that's how you and I met. That's how I've met a number of thoughtful and interesting people in my life. And I would say between LinkedIn and Twitter, most of my social network was created there. So it's really great to go to events sometimes and run into your social media friends, and you finally get to meet them in person and handshake or hug and, spend some time and have a real beer instead of a virtual coffee. So, for me, I've been saying this for many years, I got out of college in 2003, right when the internet was really, really starting to take off. And LinkedIn came about at a time when it was early in my career. And so I went, kind of deep on LinkedIn, not because I was never thinking about anything like a brand presence or building my image. It was all about just being curious and wanting to meet people that were smarter than me and interesting people. And then over time, I've been approached, by really interesting and amazing people on LinkedIn and Twitter, and gotten the chance to engage, and was really fortunate early in my career to be exposed to some amazing entrepreneurs that were super generous with their time and always willing to share thoughts and advice for free. And so I've always wanted to exemplify that and share my time and my experiences with other people that thought that I could be helpful. And so I think that ongoing mantra in my life of advice is free and be kind to everybody. I think it's helped me leverage social media as a way to meet authentic people that I genuinely care about and really want to have a relationship with. So I've been telling people for almost 20 years now, all the success that I found in my career, almost all of it can be attributed back to LinkedIn. And then probably over the last 5 years, Twitter pretty substantially as well. So my advice to young people, I have a nephew right now that just broke into the business. He just got into the trucking world and was living with me in Omaha for a little bit after he got out of college while he was, kind of getting up to speed in his new career. And one of the first things that we did, over the weekend when he moved in with me for a short time was to get online, set up his LinkedIn profile, start making some connections. And I spend a lot of time talking to young people about, best practices in connecting with people and not letting, these relationships fade away because our networks are our net worth. And I wouldn't have any of the opportunities available to me today if I wasn't open to taking people's messages and setting up time to get to know them.
Yeah, no, 100%. I completely agree with it. I mean, I've met many good clients and candidates, from the recruitment side through LinkedIn, struck up some very good relationships. And, I joke about it being where I live my life, but it is true. It's where you meet, everybody that you do business with nowadays. For sure. It's a fantastic.
I think, one thing, especially about being in the startup community is, you certainly spend a lot of time working in the digital forwarding community, and there's never a one-to-one linear correlation between, I sent this guy a message and then he became my next candidate or my next customer. But what I find is whether it's engaging in social media or engaging in events or engaging in various online communities, is you get to know the people that you need to know. You get the opportunity to meet the people that know the people that you want to know. And really, what I think you've done a great job of is branding your specific expertise.
Yeah.
Like when we first started communicating, and I'm always excited to meet an energetic and polished recruitment professional because, of all these startups that I support, somebody's always looking for somebody.
Yeah.
And it's great to be able to connect them with the specific recruitment personnel or a professional that can help them. And so, there was opportunities that I sent your way in the beginning that you just said, hey, greatly appreciate, not the best fit for me. Like I'm really focused on the international global trade, digital forwarding professionals. And you were willing to kind of take a look at some other opportunities, but if it was too far outside of your swim lane, you were quick to make sure that I didn't think that you were going to be spending any time on this for me, and I could get it in the hands of somebody else who was maybe a little bit better suited for that. So, I think those are the types of things that, your online, your online presence can help define certainly who you are. And then it's really incumbent on you as the sort of human to say who you're not, right? And make sure that you're kind of like supporting people in the areas where you can be helpful and not wasting their time in the others.
Yeah. No, and with that, we're all about, continuous improvement. I know we talked about positions that might not have been quite, where my remit really is. But building a team underneath me is where, those areas might come into it, and where we might be, adding people that can end up specializing in those areas. So, long may it continue.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So looking into the future, Charley, looking at some of the more innovative companies, we've talked about progress and where the business needs to go, where, these new startups need to target. When we look into the future, what do you think, or what would be your 3 predictions, whether it's short or long term, for logistics and supply chain technology market?
So I think there's an easy way to answer that. I write about each year, I write about predictions and categories, technology categories that I'm starting to see catch some traction. So that's been a few months since I put that one together, but off of the top of my head from memory, I think freight fintech is an extremely interesting category right now, because you've seen anytime a vessel goes this way, whether it's a truck or a boat or a plane, there's money for that order going this way. And so, being able to intertwine those two elements of the transaction and automate a lot of the payments is particularly interesting. I think there's also been a lot of focus and interest on the largest banks in the world of putting money to work in the supply chain. Yeah. And there's been very few entry points historically. So, I think you mentioned Flexport and Fordo, both those companies have really developed nice strategies around deployment of working capital in the form of trade finance, which is really interesting. The well-funded seed round I mentioned yesterday, or that was announced yesterday, is an American startup here in the trade finance space that went out and fetched $6 or $7 million in a Series A. So also Freight Pay here in the US announced a seed round just a couple of weeks ago. And they're really building out like a kind of a build.com type platform for freight forwarders. Basic Block is another company I spent a lot of time with here in the US that announced just under $80 million of capital raised just a couple of months ago. They put that out. So, the banks are really looking to put their money to work in this space, and the technology layer is going to help them do that. So freight fintech is important. We're also seeing a lot around computer vision right now, where edge computing has enabled cameras to do more than just view things. So you're starting to see software applications that are living behind the camera and actually telling operators like when inefficient or unsafe things are happening, in various elements of the supply chain, from companies like Raybot delivering that technology at the packing level to Voxel Labs developing it for inside the warehouse for safety reasons. So you're seeing a lot of stuff behind computer vision. And then the last category is one that I just won't go away. I call just visibility, holistically. And I would say that as Project 44 has really continued to just carve out their place as the #1 data provider in the world, companies like Shipio and 4Kites are making efforts to try to keep up. But Project 44 continues to just knock down acquisitions, both the public ones that they talk about and the private ones that I only hear about from the community. So as they continue to add and aggregate, I'm still seeing innovative startups popping up around the areas of sustainability data. And I know that that's, one of the number one topics that the big visibility providers are having with their customers right now. I think also visibility in some areas that were previously viewed as black boxes. So like your in-port visibility, port terminal visibility, in-cab visibility, like tracking and recording drivers' behaviors in the visibility. So, those are some of the areas, I think, 3 kind of categories, like where maybe nobody's going to go out and build an end-to-end visibility platform that's going to compete with Project 44 in the next couple of years, but certainly developing platforms that can capture data and sell it back into the Project 44s and the freight waves of the world. I think the actual manufacturers of the data in visibility, there's still a long way to go there. And the platforms like P44 and Freight Waves and FourKites will be where that data is consumed, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I'm inclined to agree with those for sure. I mean, Project 44, like you said, acquiring Convey recently is, a big statement into, what their intentions are. And like you said, carving out their place is the number one in the world. I don't, you said within the next few years, potentially somebody, it would be difficult. It really would. But yeah, no, it's very, very insightful. From my end, I think some of the things that I can see happening in the future, both long term and short term, we obviously saw Uber Freight take a big step into try and cementing their place as a major player with the acquisition of Transplace. I reckon we could definitely see a big acquisition happening when we look at the digital forwarding side as well. That I've mentioned them a couple of times on this call. Obviously, we've got Flexport, we've got Forto. I think one of those two could definitely make a big move, and I'd be inclined more so to say Forto. I think they're probably the biggest competitor to Flexport at the moment in that space, and to take that jump and get closer to them, I think would be something that's definitely on the cards. You talk about visibility, definitely when you look at ocean freight, it's it's a tough place to be right now, really, really tough place to be. And when you look at the challenges that the shippers and the carriers are having with each other, visibility, number one, is one of the main things. So that tracking element of it, to have the real-time visibility, there's a few players in there right now, and I reckon we can see a few more added to that, and a few big investments within the future, definitely trying to speed that process up. And even when we look at the ports and the terminals of the world, there is investment in there. We've got, when you look at the traditional side of it with DP World, they've obviously made their own acquisitions recently, but I think when we look at the software side of it, things that need to speed up are going to happen in the future for sure.
Agreed.
To conclude this episode then, if any businesses within logistics and supply chain tech are listening in, where would the benefit from working with a company like Zebox, where would that come from, and what makes you unique?
Yeah, we're really well suited to help companies at Zebox America who are on their journey towards developing a product that's gonna deliver value in this space. And we generally work with companies who are post product development, maybe pre-seed to like pre-series A is kind of the sweet spot. So really looking for companies who have demonstrated some traction. They've got their product in the hands of some users. It could be in supply chain, it could be outside of supply chain, with the ambition of growing their presence in supply chain and logistics. But we want to work with the companies that are focused on really driving significant growth in their business and are open to the changes they're going to need to make, and take the coaching that we offer and provide, and the coaching of the community to adapt their product to meet the needs of the largest enterprises in the supply chain around the world. So companies that are really focused on taking their business, to the top level globally would be well served by taking a look at Zebox and thinking through how they could work with our corporate partner group and then partnering with us to develop their messaging and their presentation and their product to meet the needs of the corporate partners.
Amazing. Amazing, Charley. Thank you so much for your time today. An absolute pleasure to connect as usual.
It's always a pleasure. Hope to stay in touch and speak again. And of course, if your travels bring you to the US, we'd love to welcome you here in DC, and you'd have a great place to crash here at Zebox in Arlington while you're here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.